May 9, 1945. 5:23 a.m. A temporary holding facility outside Wilhelmshaven, Lower Saxony. The knock came in darkness. 3 sharp raps that jolted them from shallow sleep, from dreams that offered no escape. Then boots on concrete, deliberate, approaching. The kind of sound that makes your breath catch, that makes you count the seconds until the door opens and whatever comes next begins. 22 women sat up in the cold, their hands instinctively moving to smooth hair, straightened clothes, small gestures of dignity before the end. They'd been told the night before, formation at dawn. Bring nothing. Say nothing. Bring nothing. Those words carried the weight of finality. One woman, Ilse, a signals operator from Hamburg who'd spent the last year decoding Allied transmissions in a bunker that shook with each bombardment, whispered to the woman beside her, "At least it will be quick." The door opened. A Canadian sergeant stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn gray, his rifle slung across his back. He spoke in careful German, formation outside. Now. They filed out into air so cold it burned their lungs. Lined up against the wall of the building, facing east where the sky was just beginning to pale. This was it. This was the moment they'd been preparing for since surrender, the reckoning, the payment, the end. The sergeant walked down the line counting. Then he said something that made no sense. "Follow me to the mess facility. Breakfast is ready." "I thought I'd misheard," Ilse would write weeks later. Breakfast. The word seemed to come from another language, another world. We were supposed to die. We were given porridge instead. They expected execution. They got breakfast. And in that impossible reversal, everything they thought they knew about enemies began to fracture. The moment unfolds with the terrible clarity of reprieve arriving when you've already made peace with death. May 1945. The war had been over for less than 24 hours. Less than a day since the German surrender, since the shooting stopped, since 6 years of mechanized slaughter ground to an administrative halt with signatures on paper. But surrender didn't mean safety. It meant uncertainty, the terrifying gap between being enemy combatants and becoming something else. Prisoners, detainees, internees, or simply dead. The women lined up against that wall were auxiliary personnel, Nachrichtenhelferinnen and Stabshelferinnen, the signals operators and administrative staff who'd kept Wehrmacht communications and logistics functioning. They'd worn uniforms, lived in barracks, followed orders. When their units collapsed or retreated without them, when the officers fled and the chain of command dissolved, they were simply there, women in military dress when the Canadians arrived. The propaganda had been explicit. They knew what happened to women captured by the enemy. The stories had been designed to prevent surrender, to make death seem preferable to capture. All night, waiting for dawn, they'd whispered prayers and farewells and tried to find courage for what was coming. But what came was a Canadian mess sergeant carrying a clipboard and speaking about breakfast. The mess facility was a converted warehouse, requisitioned by Canadian forces 2 days earlier. Long tables. Benches. A serving line where steam rose from containers that smelled impossibly of food, real food, cooked food, abundant food. The women stood at the entrance, paralyzed by cognitive dissonance. Condemned prisoners don't get breakfast. The dead don't need to eat. Sit, the sergeant said. Not harsh. Not gentle. Just procedural, the tone of someone following orders that made sense to him even if they made no sense to anyone else. They sat. Slowly, carefully, like people expecting the floor to give way beneath them. Canadian soldiers, mess personnel, cooks, a few guards, moved with the practiced efficiency of morning routine. Plates were passed down the tables. Porridge, thick and substantial. Bread, actual wheat bread. Margarine. Jam from Red Cross supplies. Ilse stared at the plate in front of her. At the spoon beside it. At the food that steamed gently in the cold morning air. Her hands shook when she picked up the spoon. Around her, other women did the same, lifting food to their mouths with the mechanical movements of people whose brains hadn't caught up with their circumstances. The porridge was hot. It tasted of oats and milk and salt and the impossible possibility that they might actually survive this. Halfway through the meal, someone started crying. Quiet, contained, but unstoppable. Then another. Then another. Not sobs. Just tears streaming down faces while they ate, while they processed the gap between what they'd expected and what they'd received. A Canadian private, young, maybe 22, from somewhere with an accent that made German sound musical, approached with more tea. He refilled cups without comment, without judgment, just did his job and moved on. He poured tea like we were people, Ilse wrote. Not enemies. Not condemned. Just people who needed tea. That small act of normalcy broke something in me that 6 years of war hadn't touched. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. After breakfast came processing. The women were photographed, documented, assigned identification numbers. Their information was recorded in triplicate on forms that would be filed in some vast administrative system. Names, ages, last postings, skills. The bureaucracy of occupation, the machinery that turns combatants into categories. Then came the speech. A Canadian captain, Morrison from Toronto, a lawyer in civilian life, addressed them through a translator. You are classified as civilian internees under Allied military government authority. You will be held pending documentation and repatriation. You will be housed, fed, and given medical care. There are rules. They will be explained. Violation of rules will result in disciplinary action. Cooperation will be noted. You are not soldiers. You are not criminals. You are persons under detention. Act accordingly. The words landed strangely. Not soldiers. Not criminals. Persons under detention. One woman, Greta, who'd been a logistics coordinator, raised her hand tentatively. Yes. Sir, we expected. We were told that captured personnel would be. She couldn't finish. Couldn't say executed, punished, made to suffer. Morrison's expression didn't change. You were told propaganda. Propaganda is designed to prevent surrender by making capture seem worse than death. It's a lie. We don't execute prisoners. We process them. Welcome to paperwork and waiting. It's boring, but you'll live through it. The facility at Wilhelmshaven was temporary, a way station while the Canadians established more permanent arrangements. The women were moved after 3 days to a converted barracks outside Bremen, then after 2 weeks to a larger facility that would house them for months. The transport was by military truck, supervised but not brutal. They carried their few possessions in bundles, still half expecting betrayal, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it didn't. The trucks delivered them to barracks with bunks and blankets. To a mess hall with regular meals. To a compound with fencing and guards, yes, but also with latrines that functioned, with a medical station with the basic architecture of order. The policy behind this treatment was encoded in Geneva Convention obligations that Canada took seriously, partly from genuine principle, partly from pragmatic self-interest. How you treated enemy prisoners established precedent for how your own prisoners would be treated. And Canada had prisoners in German hands who they desperately wanted returned alive. But policy doesn't explain the tea. Doesn't explain the sergeant who'd said breakfast is ready, instead of just marching them to the mess hall without explanation. Doesn't explain the small, grinding gears of decency that operated beneath the bureaucratic machinery. The days acquired structure with surprising speed. Morning roll call at 7. Breakfast in the mess hall, porridge, bread, tea. Work assignments, kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning, administrative tasks for those with clerical skills. Lunch at noon. Dinner at 6. Evening roll call. Lights out at 10. The work was real but not punishing. No one was beaten for working slowly. No one collapsed from exhaustion. It was simply work, the basic maintenance that any community requires. And slowly, imperceptibly, they stopped being prisoners expecting death and started being something else. Internees. Detainees. Women in limbo waiting. Ilse was assigned to the administrative office, helping translate documents. She worked alongside a Canadian corporal, Davies, from Montreal, who typed with 2 fingers and occasionally cursed in French when the carbon paper smudged. One afternoon, Davies set down a requisition form and asked, "Did you believe it? What they told you about us?" "Some of it." "Which parts?" "That you'd be vengeful. That we'd be dealt with." Davies was quiet for a moment. "We're angry. Don't mistake process for forgiveness. We're angry about what Germany did, what the war cost. But anger at a nation isn't the same as hatred for individuals. You're not Hitler. You're a clerk who followed orders. There's a difference." "He separated me from my government," Ilse wrote. "I had assumed collective guilt meant collective punishment. He showed me that justice was more complicated than revenge. I'm still trying to understand that distinction." Greta struggled more than most. She'd been a true believer, not in the atrocities which she claimed not to have known about, but in the righteousness of Germany's cause. The camp dismantled that belief piece by piece. First, when she saw how the Canadians treated refugees, Polish forced laborers, Dutch civilians, even German Jews who'd somehow survived. No hierarchy of suffering. Just people who needed food, shelter, documentation. Second, when the Red Cross arrived and distributed parcels. Soap, toothbrushes, writing paper, chocolate. The guards didn't steal from the supplies. didn't demand bribes. Just distributed them according to lists efficiently, fairly. Third, when she overheard two Canadian soldiers talking. One showed a photograph, a wife, a baby, a house in Saskatchewan. The other showed his own photo. Parents on a farm, a dog, a life interrupted by war. They looked at those photographs the way she'd looked at pictures of her own family before bombs had made such pictures into relics. The enemy had families, had loves, had vulnerabilities that looked exactly like hers. I had needed them to be monsters, Greta wrote. It was simpler that way. But they were men who missed home. And that was harder to bear than hatred. Margaret had been a telephone operator, routing calls for a Wehrmacht command post. 26 years old, competent, someone who'd survived by being essential. She'd been at her switchboard when the Canadians arrived, still trying to connect calls for units that no longer existed. At the camp, she found herself drawn to the fence line during evening free time, staring at the horizon, trying to imagine what came next. One evening, a Canadian guard, Sergeant Mitchell from a farm outside Calgary, approached. "Homesick?" he asked in broken German. She shrugged. "I don't know what home is anymore." Mitchell nodded. Pulled out a cigarette, lit it, offered her one. She hesitated, then took it. They smoked in silence, watching the sun set over a landscape that looked nothing like Hamburg. "My dad fought in the last war," Mitchell said. "France. 1917 he came home different. Quieter. He'd say the worst thing wasn't the fighting. It was after. Realizing the men he'd been trying to kill were just men. That if he'd been born 30 miles east, he'd have been them. And you? I think about it every day. That you and me were just accidents of geography. You were born there. I was born here. That's the only difference. The rest is just uniforms and orders." "He gave me no absolution," Margaret wrote. "Just recognition that we were both caught in something larger than ourselves. That didn't erase responsibility. But it made responsibility bearable. The transformation happened in moments too small to notice until you added them up. A German woman asking for extra blankets and receiving them without interrogation. A Canadian cook teaching an internee his recipe for bannock, the two of them working side by side despite no common language beyond gestures and the universal grammar of cooking. A shared moment of laughter when someone tripped carrying laundry and scattered clean sheets across the muddy yard, and instead of punishment there was just the collective groan of, well, that needs washing again. One evening the camp organized a concert, volunteers from both sides. A German woman sang Schubert. A Canadian soldier played harmonica. Someone recited poetry badly in two languages. It was amateur, awkward, tentative. But it was also human. Captain Morrison attended, standing at the back. When it ended, he said nothing about reconciliation or forgiveness. Just, "Thank you. That was needed." He didn't call it healing, Ilse wrote. Just needed. As if beauty was something both sides required to stay human. That honesty mattered more than any speech about peace. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. August brought Japan's surrender and the war's complete end. The camp held a subdued acknowledgement, not celebration given that half the people present were on the losing side, but recognition that something had ended. That evening, the mess hall served a better meal than usual. Not a feast, but chicken instead of the usual stew, real potatoes, pie for dessert. The women ate in silence, processing the reality that the war was over but their captivity continued. They'd be repatriated eventually, but eventually was measured in months, not days. Sergeant Mitchell found Margaret outside after dinner. "Scared?" he asked. "Of going home?" "Yes." "Why?" The story does not end with redemption because redemption implies exchange. Virtue earned through suffering, accounts balanced. These women didn't earn their breakfast through good behavior or moral transformation. They were simply fed according to standards that applied regardless of who they were or what uniform they'd worn. But breakfast has consequences. Not immediate. Not direct. But real. Every meal that arrived on schedule, every moment when cruelty was possible but not chosen, every small act of procedural decency. These accumulated into an education about what civilization meant when maintained under pressure. 70 years later, a historian conducting research on Canadian military government interviewed a veteran who'd served at the Bremen facility. He was 93, living in a care home in Halifax, his memory sharp despite his age. "Do you remember the first morning?" the historian asked. "When you brought the German women to breakfast instead of whatever they expected?" The man was quiet for a long time. "Then, I remember their faces. The disbelief. The way they cried while they ate. Some of the guys in my unit thought we were being soft. Thought they should be punished, not fed. But Captain Morrison, he said, punishment is one thing, cruelty is another. We punish Germany, but we feed prisoners. That's the difference between justice and revenge. I think about that a lot. About how easy it would have been to choose cruelty. How we chose standards instead. Do you think it mattered? I hope so. But even if it didn't, we can live with what we did. That matters too. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, subscribe. History is full of moments like this, hidden in plain sight. Don't miss the next one. The knock that came in darkness, sharp and final, echoed through decades. It was a knock that could have meant death. That probably should have meant death, given the logic of war and the weight of what Germany had done. But it meant breakfast. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something fragile and necessary took root. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness was too large, too complicated, too freighted with questions about who had the right to forgive what. But something smaller and more durable. The recognition that maintaining civilization toward the defeated was not weakness but strength. That feeding prisoners was not generosity but simply what civilized nations did, even to those who'd stopped being civilized themselves. The women who stood against that wall expecting execution learned something propaganda hadn't prepared them for, that their enemies were capable of restraint. That victory didn't require cruelty. That the gap between enemy and executioner was wider than they'd been told. The Canadian soldiers who brought breakfast instead of bullets made a choice that morning. Not to forgive. Not to forget. But to maintain standards even when abandoning them would have been understandable, even justifiable. They chose to be the kind of people who fed prisoners not because prisoners deserved food, but because they deserved to be the kind of people who fed prisoners. That choice didn't erase anything. Didn't balance scales or wash away blood. But it established something. A precedent, a principle, a small grinding gear in the machinery of civilization that said even in the aftermath of total war, even when hatred was justified and vengeance was available, there was still a line they would not cross. The war had taught them to expect death at dawn. The peace, slow and imperfect and conditional, taught them something harder. That mercy was possible even when it wasn't required. That breakfast, served without ceremony, could be a statement more powerful than any speech about justice or reconciliation or the responsibilities of the victor. They braced for execution. They got porridge. And in that impossible reversal, the future became imaginable again.